Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Imagine you're about to board a commercial flight. You walk through the jet bridge, find your seat, buckle your seatbelt, and wait for takeoff. Now ask yourself a simple question. How much do you actually know about the pilot? Probably almost nothing. You don't know where they grew up. You don't know their political beliefs. You don't know which party they voted for. You don't know their religion. You don't know their race. And, honestly, you probably don't care. There's only one thing that matters. Can they safely fly the airplane? It's a remarkably simple standard. Competence comes first. Everything else comes second. Now let me ask a much harder question. Should Americans think about their military the same way? That question has become one of the most controversial debates in American politics, and it recently took center stage when Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth addressed the graduating class at West Point. Some people heard his speech and thought it was exactly what America's military needed. Others believed it was another example of politics entering the armed forces. But, regardless of where you stand politically, Hegseth raised a question that's much bigger than one speech, one administration, or even one political party. What is the military actually for? That sounds like an obvious question. But in today's America, it isn't. For most of American history, the answer seems straightforward. The military exists to defend the nation, to deter America's enemies, and, if necessary, to fight and win wars. Those goals didn't require much explanation because they were widely accepted across the political spectrum. Today, however, the conversation has become much more complicated. Over the past decade, Americans have watched their military become part of broader cultural debates. Questions about diversity, questions about gender, questions about recruitment, questions about inclusion, questions about political messaging. For some Americans, these changes represent progress. For others, they represent distraction. That's why Hegseth's speech received so much attention. It wasn't simply about military strategy. It was about identity. His central message was remarkably clear. The military should focus on one mission above everything else: winning wars. Not social engineering, not political activism, not serving as a model for every cultural trend happening in civilian society. Just winning. Whether you agree with him or not, that's a simple philosophy. And simple philosophies often resonate because they force us to ask uncomfortable questions. Let's imagine two different military commanders. One says, "Our highest priority is making sure every demographic group feels equally represented." The other says, "Our highest priority is making sure every unit is as prepared for combat as possible." Which commander would you want leading troops into battle? Most Americans would probably answer the second one without much hesitation. But here's where the conversation becomes more complicated. Does supporting diversity automatically mean lowering military standards? Not necessarily. And this is where much of America's political debate often becomes oversimplified. The term DEI gets thrown around constantly. Some people hear it and immediately think about fairness, opportunity, and removing unnecessary barriers. Others hear the exact same phrase and think about quotas, lowered standards, and political ideology. Those are completely different assumptions, and unless we separate them, it's almost impossible to have an honest discussion. Let's start with something I think almost everyone can agree on. Military standards matter. A lot. In fact, they probably matter more than standards in almost any other profession. If an accountant makes a mistake, money may be lost. If a lawyer makes a mistake, a case may be lost. If a soldier makes a mistake during combat, people may die. The consequences are fundamentally different. That's why military organizations throughout history have placed such enormous emphasis on discipline, preparation, and competence. Battlefields don't reward good intentions. They reward effectiveness. History doesn't remember armies because they had the best slogans. It remembers armies because they won. That may sound harsh, but war has always been harsh. Bullets don't care about political debates. Missiles don't stop to consider social theories. Enemy forces don't ask whether your organization has achieved perfect representation. They only care whether you can defeat them. This is the point Hegseth was trying to emphasize. He argued that America's military should judge itself primarily by one standard. Can it successfully accomplish its mission? Everything else should be secondary. Now, whether you agree with that conclusion or not, I think it's important to understand why this message resonates with so many Americans. Over the last several years, many conservatives have become increasingly concerned that institutions originally built around performance are gradually shifting toward other priorities. The military, police departments, fire departments, air traffic control, even medical schools. The concern isn't necessarily diversity itself. The concern is whether identity ever becomes more important than competence. That's a legitimate question. Because public trust depends on confidence. When you call 911, you want the most qualified firefighter. When you're lying on an operating table, you want the most capable surgeon. When your family boards an airplane, you want the best trained pilot. Most Americans instinctively understand this. Competence creates trust. So naturally, many people apply the same logic to the military. If America expects its armed forces to defend the country during its worst moments, shouldn't excellence remain the highest priority? Again, that's a reasonable question. But here's where I think both sides of the debate often talk past each other. Critics of DEI sometimes assume every diversity initiative automatically lowers standards. Supporters of DEI often assume every criticism comes from prejudice or resistance to change. Reality is rarely that simple. Some diversity programs simply expand recruitment efforts. Others focus on mentorship. Some attempt to eliminate unnecessary barriers that have nothing to do with military performance. Those policies may have little impact on operational standards. Other proposals, however, become controversial precisely because critics argue they could influence promotion systems, hiring decisions, or performance expectations. Those deserve careful scrutiny. Notice the difference. The real debate shouldn't be whether diversity is good or bad. The real debate should be much narrower. Does a specific policy make America's military stronger or weaker? That's the question worth asking. Because if a policy improves readiness, strengthens recruitment, and maintains standards, many Americans would support it regardless of its label. But if a policy reduces effectiveness, even with good intentions, it deserves to be reconsidered. That's not politics. That's accountability. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson from Hegseth's speech. He wasn't simply criticizing one set of policies. He was challenging Americans to rethink what they expect from one of the country's most important institutions. Should the military primarily reflect society? Or should society accept that the military is fundamentally different from every other institution? Because unlike corporations, unlike universities, unlike social media, the military exists for one purpose that no other organization shares: preparing for war. And preparing for war requires a different way of thinking. If there's one thing both supporters and critics of Pete Hegseth can probably agree on, it's this. The debate surrounding America's military today isn't really about one speech. It's about two completely different visions of what the military should be. And until we understand those two visions, Americans will keep talking past each other. Let's start with the conservative perspective. For many conservatives, the military occupies a unique place in American society. It's not just another government agency. It's not another federal department. It's certainly not a university campus. The military exists because there are people in the world who would gladly harm the United States if given the opportunity. That reality changes everything. In civilian life, organizations often pursue multiple goals at the same time. A company wants to make money while improving its public image. A university wants to educate students while promoting research and community engagement. Even corporations today frequently talk about sustainability, diversity, and social responsibility alongside profitability. But the military doesn't have that luxury. Its first responsibility isn't public relations. It isn't social change. It isn't representing every political trend in American society. Its responsibility is far more basic. Protect the nation. If deterrence fails, fight. And if forced into war, win. That's why so many conservatives become uncomfortable whenever the military appears to spend significant time debating issues they believe belong in civilian politics. From their perspective, every hour spent discussing political ideology is an hour not spent improving combat readiness. Whether that concern is always justified is another question. But it's important to understand why they see it that way. Now let's look at the other side. Supporters of diversity initiatives generally aren't arguing that military standards should disappear. That's a common misconception. Many would argue that a stronger military requires attracting talent from every part of American society. If qualified Americans from certain communities feel excluded, the military may actually lose highly capable future officers, engineers, pilots, cyber specialists, and intelligence analysts. They would also point out something important about modern warfare. Today's military isn't only about infantry units charging across battlefields, it's about artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, space operations, advanced logistics, unmanned systems, electronic warfare. Winning future wars requires recruiting some of the smartest people in the country. Supporters argue that broadening recruitment can actually strengthen national defense. That's a serious argument, and it deserves to be taken seriously. So where does that leave us? I think both sides sometimes ask the wrong question. The debate shouldn't begin with labels like DEI or anti-DEI. Instead, every policy should face the same test. Does it improve military effectiveness? Or doesn't it? That's a much healthier framework. Because labels often stop people from thinking. Results force people to think. Imagine two hypothetical policies. Policy A expands recruiting efforts into communities that historically produced fewer military officers. Standards remain exactly the same. Graduation requirements don't change. Promotion standards don't change. Combat training doesn't change. Only the recruiting strategy changes. Would that necessarily weaken the military? I don't think most Americans would say yes. Now imagine Policy B. Promotion decisions begin giving significant weight to demographic targets rather than demonstrated performance. Combat standards become more flexible to meet predetermined representation goals. Would that raise legitimate concerns? Absolutely. Notice what's happening here. The answer isn't determined by the label. It's determined by whether standards remain intact. That's why I think one of the most important principles for any military is surprisingly simple. Opportunity should be as broad as possible. Standards should be as high as possible. Those two ideas don't have to contradict each other. In fact, the strongest institutions often pursue both at the same time. That brings us back to West Point. For over 2 centuries, West Point has represented something larger than a military academy. It represents an ideal, duty, honor, country. Those 3 words have shaped generations of American officers. What's interesting is that none of those words mention politics. None mention party affiliation. None mention ideology. They speak to service, responsibility, sacrifice. That's probably why debates about West Point generate so much attention. Americans instinctively believe that military institutions should stand above everyday political battles. Whether that's entirely possible is another matter. The military ultimately answers to civilian leadership. Every administration brings different priorities, different budgets, different strategic doctrines, different leadership styles. That's completely normal in a constitutional democracy. But there is an important distinction between changing military strategy and changing the military's fundamental identity. Strategies evolve. Technology evolves. Threats evolve. The core mission should remain remarkably consistent. Produce the most capable fighting force possible. Everything else should support that mission, not compete with it. This discussion also reflects something much bigger happening across American society. More and more institutions have become part of the country's cultural conflicts. Schools, corporations, professional sports, Hollywood, universities, even churches. The military has not escaped that trend. Some Americans see that as inevitable. Others see it as dangerous. Regardless of which side you're on, it's difficult to deny that Americans increasingly evaluate institutions through political lenses. That's unfortunate, because national defense has traditionally been one of the few areas capable of uniting Americans across party lines. Perhaps we should work harder to keep it that way. At the end of the day, America's adversaries don't care whether Republicans or Democrats are in charge. They don't care which cable news network is winning the ratings. They don't care which cultural debate dominates social media this week. They care about one thing: whether the United States remains capable of defending itself. That should remain our focus as well. So, when we debate military reform, maybe we should ask fewer ideological questions and more practical ones. Does this policy improve readiness? Does it produce better leaders? Does it strengthen discipline? Does it increase trust within military units? Does it help America deter future wars? If the answer is yes, then the policy deserves consideration. If the answer is no, then it should be reconsidered, regardless of whether it comes from Republicans or Democrats. Because national security shouldn't be measured by political victories. It should be measured by operational success. Pete Hegseth's speech wasn't significant because every American agreed with it. Far from it. It mattered because it forced the country to confront a difficult question that isn't going away. What should America's military prioritize above everything else? Different Americans will continue answering that question differently. But I hope we can at least agree on one principle. The United States doesn't need a military that wins arguments on television. It needs a military that can win on the battlefield if the unthinkable ever happens. Because history has a ruthless way of judging nations. It doesn't remember how many political debates they won. It remembers whether they were prepared when it mattered most. And if America's military can remain focused on excellence, professionalism, discipline, and mission above all else, then regardless of which administration occupies the White House, it will continue fulfilling the responsibility that has defined it since the nation's founding. Not to reflect every political moment, but to protect the American people through every political moment. That's a mission worthy of every generation that wears the uniform. Thanks for watching.